So we're talking today about Leviticus and Numbers, and let's see if I can stop myself from being really long-winded on books that most people think are super boring, but they're not.
They're awesome!
They're awesome. The title, Leviticus, which is the Greek and English title, that comes from things pertaining to the Levites. But it's not just about the Levites, that's just one aspect of it. In keeping with our tradition of the Hebrew name being the first prominent word of the book, we have the Hebrew name Vayechara, which means "and he called." So we're going to look at the first verse. Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. So Moses can't go into the tent of meeting. It's We talked about that in Exodus, how the glory cloud comes down and he's not allowed in. No Israelite is allowed in because we discovered this attribute of God called holiness. And holiness is like God is perfect. He's emanating this power of perfection. And we can't go near him because we're sinful, and Israel is sinful, and they're corrupt. So, not even Moses, Israel's representative, the holiest of them, can go in to the tabernacle. And so, the entire book of Leviticus is dedicated to answering the question, how can a holy God live in the midst of a sinful and rebellious people? And there's four primary answers. Ritual sacrifices and observance of specific festivals, the mediating priesthood, ritual and moral purity, and the Day of Atonement. So you can go to slide 2. That's what we're going to talk about as we go through this book. We encounter something called a chiasm. This is a form of Hebrew writing, and as you can see from the board and from here, this is just a general example of what it looks like. There's a central theme, and each theme on the book will move towards the central theme, and then the parallels of those themes will move away. So like first theme, and then there's a parallel, and the parallel can be either pertaining to the same thing or the same sort of idea, or it can be something opposite. And sometimes in the middle there is no central theme, it's just two parallels, and then it moves away again. So you see here we have rituals, sacrifices, and ritual festivals. Priests ordained and priest qualifications. Purity, ritual purity, and moral purity. And then in the middle we have the Day of Atonement. So we're going to move through the book. And you can go to the next slide. Sacrifices. Ritual sacrifices. Yeah, we're going to kill that. There's 5 primary sacrifices. The burnt offering is the first one. This was done every single day, 3 times a day by the priests, and it was also done by Israelites. So the animal was brought to the entrance of the tent, and a hand was laid on it. This is a symbolic gesture to say, my sin is going onto this animal, and also I should be this animal. And then you kill it. The person who just did that kills it, and they skin it, and they cut it into pieces, and they say, this is what should happen to me because of my sin. It's a very powerful picture to have to personally kill an animal and see, this is what my sin does to people. This is what it does to the world. It had to be an unblemished male, and it had to be a strong animal. Giving a weak animal is a demonstration of the heart of the worshiper. That's talked about in the prophets later in Malachi. God doesn't want weak animals because it's not because of the animal, it's because of the heart of the worshiper. If you were poor, you were probably going to bring a bird instead. And the indication here is not that God values the bird less than the bull. It's that he values the heart once again. The person's bird was worth as much as the animal, but you give what you can. Like, think about how big of a financial investment that is to kill a whole entire bull. That's a big deal. If any of you grew up on farms, you know they're a very expensive animal, and they're worth a lot of money, especially when you raise them from birth and you put all this time and energy into it. It's a big financial burden to kill an animal. This first sacrifice is a way of asking for forgiveness for your sins. Second sacrifice, the grain offering. This is finely ground flour. It's not whole grains. That's actually used in a different sacrifice. But only a small portion of this was burned as a reminder. It's not exactly clear who's being reminded of what, but it's probably a reminder that God has provided for us. Only a portion was burned, and the rest of this went to the priest. And this is really important because they lived on this. What the priests ate and what they got as far as food and stuff like that, it was entirely contingent on the Israelite community. They didn't eat if the Israelites didn't sacrifice. So this is where they got their food. And this sacrifice, the second one, is a way of showing thankfulness to God. Third sacrifice is the fellowship offering. This is similar to the burnt offering, except for in the first offering, the whole animal is burned, and in this one, only part of the animal is burned. Just the fat portions or whatever. And also female animals were acceptable. The meat is divided between the priests and the worshiper's family. So once again, the priests eat because the people give. Christian eats because we give.
Because we screw up, we eat?
No, because we give.
But isn't that what you're saying more or less, dude?
No.
Really?
I'm not saying that.
He didn't sign up for the bad part.
Okay, but see here. This is another sacrifice for thankfulness. So this is not because of sin.
Oh, okay.
This is because you're giving to God because you're grateful for what He's done in your life, and including you in the covenant community of Israel, or in this case, the church. Next offering is the sin offering. This is for anyone who engages in unintentional sin. And what that is, this unintentional aspect of it is very important. Hebrew law distinguishes between intentionally evil acts and unintentional evil. Makes mistakes we make in our daily lives. We all screw up. We all let swear words slip sometimes, and it's not this premeditated thing like David, plotting to murder and kill and have sex with Bathsheba and all that. It's not like that. This is like when we make a mistake. And it's divided into rules for 4 categories of people: the priests, the whole community, the leaders, and the common people. And chapter 5, verse 1 through 13 gives examples of what this kind of sin might look like. It's mostly matters of conscience, and then there's also instructions for sacrifice. This is a way, again, of asking for forgiveness of sins. Next offering, the last one, is the guilt offering. This last type of offering was also for unintentional sins, but it was in regard to material things. They had a lot of material things that were considered holy, and the word that's distinctive here is restitution, which comes, that's the English word we're using for it, but it comes from the root word shin lamed mem, or shalom. Peace, welfare, completeness. You guys have probably heard that word before. This is a way to make peace with an unintentional sin regarding the holy things that were consecrated to the service of God in the sanctuary. You realize that this is something you need to do when you feel guilty and you put your mind at rest. The item's value was paid plus 1/5, so you're paying more than what the item is actually worth. And this is, again, a way for asking for forgiveness of sins. And then the first section, the rest of chapter 6 and 7, are about laws for the sacrifices of the priests. So, to sum this first section up, there are 2 ritual sacrifices for thankfulness to God and 3 for forgiveness of sins. Here's a quote by Tim Mackey. He said, "These sacrifices are not the basis of Israel's relationship with God. They are Israel's response to God's gracious invitation to enter into a covenant relationship. In other words, we're saved by grace, through faith, not of works." Okay, next section. Priests ordained.
I got a question.
What's up?
You said that these burnt offerings happen 3 times a day. Is that just for the first one or for all of them combined? that they happen 3 times a day.
The priests offer them 3 times a day, and then Israelites offer them additionally, I think.
But for each, like, for all of the,
Same for all 5 sacrifices.
yeah, it is? It's not just for the one first, okay?
You're asking if the 3 sacrifices during the day are for
All the things that, yeah.
I would argue no. I would argue it would be
Yeah.
evidence on or contingent on the person bringing it to the priest.
Yeah, I think the Israelites offered when they did something wrong, and then sacrifices were offered every single day, 3 times a day. So this, like what you and me would offer as just common people, not priests, is an addition to what the priests were offering already. Okay, ordination ceremony of the priest. It returns to a story about the process of Moses inaugurating the priests at Sinai. So that happens, and they do all the stuff, and God's response for their sacrifices and their consecration and all of that stuff is in 9:24 it says, "Then fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces." This is a good thing. God accepts their sacrifice. He's pleased with what they have been doing. But then, right after that, we encounter slide 4. People burning to death. Nadab and Abihu are Aaron's sons. They're priests. They're a big deal. They could potentially be the high priest because they're of Aaron's bloodline. They recklessly rush in to worship God on their own terms, and they die for their actions. They bring in profane fire, is what it says. So God lit the fires at the beginning of these sacrifices, and they were supposed to use that fire. But this is foreign to God. The point here is that God needs to be treated as holy. He demands to be approached in a certain way. We see, we read recently in the book of Acts that God killed 2 people who lied to him in his new covenant community as they were being inaugurated. And I have to wonder if there's a parallel there. 2 people are killed here for profaning the name of God, for doing something wrong. And then in the book of Acts, Ananias and Sapphira die in Acts chapter 5 because they lied to God, and they lied to Peter, they lied to the Spirit of God. So I think there is a parallel there. I haven't really heard anybody talk about it, but that's okay. I have thoughts too. God takes his covenant community very seriously. And this situation, Israel goes on, if you've read any of the Old Testament, to sin horribly thousands of times. Just they always are turning away, and they have really dark periods of apostasy. But God doesn't do this again. He warned them once, and he showed we're supposed to take this very seriously. Same with Ananias and Sapphira. He warned them one time. We're supposed to take his new covenant very seriously. Remember, this is inaugurated with blood. The blood of animals initially, and now with human blood, the blood of Jesus. Jesus' blood was spilled for us, so he warned Israel only once. He has warned us only once with Ananias and Sapphira. Israel didn't listen, and I think we should ask ourselves if we have. Moving on, there's additional regulations for priests mentioned in 10, 8 through 20. The conclusion of this section is that the priests were inaugurated, and God must be met with fear and reverence because he is holy. The next section down here is ritual purity laws. These laws pertain to ritual purity, not moral purity. Chapter 11 is about animals that are unclean and touching animal carcasses and stuff. They were abhorrent, not because they were evil, but because they barred you from the presence of God. You couldn't go to tabernacle if you had touched some of these things. There are theories as to why these animals are clean and unclean, such as diseases and stuff like that. Most plausible is that the nations around them were sacrificing some of these animals and eating them, and God wanted them to be separate and to make a demonstration. Canaanites sacrificed pigs to idols and all of that stuff. Chapter 12 is about childbirth. Obviously, childbirth is not sinful, part of our purpose. God-defined purpose is to be fruitful and multiply, according to Genesis and Exodus. But there's a law stuck in there that has actually a really nice social benefit. Women were allowed several weeks to rest after having a child. They were released from their obligations because they were unclean. So God instituted maternity leave long before that was a concept in our minds. And we don't really know why it's different, the amount of time for males and females. Probably theories about that too. Chapters 13 and 14 is about skin diseases and fabrics. Once again, these things it's not sinful to contract a disease. You didn't necessarily do something wrong, but what we do see in the New Testament is that Israel had developed this attitude that they were connected to sin. And Jesus refutes this in Luke and in John. He says, do you think that these people who this tower fell on, do you think they were worse sinners than other people? And the answer is no. And then also he asks, who sinned? Was it this guy or was it his parents that this man was born blind? And Jesus says neither. But he was made this way for God's glorification. Chapter 15 is about genital discharges. Some of these indicate that something is wrong with you and you have death, in your body, or you have a disease or a sickness or something. But when male and female bodily fluids mix, they create life. So you'd think, oh, that's a great thing. Life. Why would that bar me from the presence of the tabernacle? Well, having a child, to this day, actually, is still a very dangerous thing, especially in a society without hospitals. Rachel lost her life in Genesis when she had Benjamin. So our conclusion is ritual impurity was normal for all Israelites. It was something they all went through, and it was reversed by washing your body and your hands, patience, and sacrifice. We don't necessarily know why every single specific law is given, but the main reason is that these things were connected to death. The danger of childbirth and skin diseases and the idolatrous, animal sacrifices and stuff. It's not sinful to be unclean. It's sinful to rush into the presence of a holy God covered in aspects of death. So in the center, we have the Day of Atonement, chapters 16 and 17. Israel has a specific holiday called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And this is the only time that the high priest, one person, gets to go into the most holy place, the place where the Ark of the Covenant is, the place where God's presence is concentrated. And the reason that he's going in there is to atone for the sins of Israel. Important to note is that a bull was sacrificed for the high priest and for his family, so he needed a sacrifice. And then 2 goats are chosen. One is that they kill it, and that's the picture of death for the people. The other one, they place their sins on it, or symbolically place their sins on it, like they did with the whole burnt offering, and they send it out into the wilderness to wander. So this is again a very strong picture. Your sin is either death, and your sin should be removed far from you. It's a strong picture of what Israel is supposed to do with their sin. And then there's additional laws about sacrifices in chapter 17. I wish we had more time because there's this one ritual where they kill a bird and then they dip a second bird in its blood and they release it in the wild. So they just release this traumatized bird. It's really, it's crazy. But I was going to go to the next slide, but I'll just wait on it. For those of you who have a bigger understanding of the Day of Atonement, there is a question I want to ask. This is more for people who have a better handle and have read these things multiple times. Matthew 27:51 says, "Suddenly the curtain of the sanctuary was torn from top to bottom, and the earth quaked and the rocks were split." And this is after Jesus' death. My question is, which curtain was torn? We are the priesthood of believers. We do ministry work. But we don't atone for sins or stand in the physical presence of God like the high priest does. The tabernacle is a reflection of the spiritual realities, and God wants the two to merge. It just is going to take time and stuff. Hebrews 4:14 through 16 says, "Our great high priest, Christ, has passed through the heavens, so we draw near." We draw near, but do we enter into the most holy place yet? Or is Christ in the most holy place before the Father, making atonement for us? We're the priesthood of believers, not the high priesthood of believers. There is only one high priest, and that's Jesus. Hebrews 6:19, our hope, firm and secure, Christ is inside the veil. So, with humility, I think we should ask this question. I might be behind the conversation where we're at or whatever, but are we allowed into the holy place or the most holy place? And it's just something to think about as you read Hebrews and Leviticus and consider, which thing we're doing. Because I don't know the answer. Just an idea that was pitched to me by a professor of mine years ago. The high priest, the conclusion of this section, besides that little tangent, is that the high priest was sinful and he needed to make atonement for his family and for himself. And only one person was allowed in the presence of God one time per year to cover for the sins of Israel. So, moving back out on the chiasm, we have purity, and this is in regard to moral purity. These things are evil. The laws about moral purity, Israel is supposed to be different than the nations around them who practice all the detestable things, specifically the Canaanites. Leviticus 18, verse 24 says, "Do not defile yourself by any of these things, for all of these, the nations which I am casting out before you for by all these things, the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled." So, these things are in regards to sexual abnormalities, human sacrifice, idolatry, hatred, deception, those types of things. These are laws against immorality. These things are evil. A note about homosexuality is that everybody was doing it back then, just like everyone's doing it now. So saying that this law is archaic is really naive, because this was accepted back then. And actually Israel goes on to do all of these things anyways. They just act like everybody. God is saying there is a specific set of boundaries for humans. God is not trying to restrict human freedom. When he establishes these boundaries, he is trying to give it to you. Living within the boundaries that he creates will allow you to be the freest type of human being that you can be. You're not capable of being any freer than within the boundaries that God has set. You will be a slave to sin if you try to live outside of his boundaries. And like a lot of us have had like addictions and stuff like that. It becomes a point where you're not doing it anymore. The drugs control you, or the alcohol controls you, and you don't have a choice as to whether or not you're going to get high or drunk that day. You have to, because sin dominates your life. So, moving on, priests, qualifications for them. Priests are held to a higher standard than other people. They are meant to be holy. The same is true in the New Testament, but not in a ritual sense. The standards for leadership are entirely contingent on character. So we should never put somebody in a place of pastoral leadership unless they have good character. In 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, that's what these passages are about. It is entirely on character, whether you get to serve in the temple of the Lord or not. Chapters 23 and through 25, rituals about Jubilee, a specific holiday that we have no record of them ever celebrating, and feast days. They had 7 feasts a year. Sabbath rest needs to be recognized weekly. And then now you can go to this table. This table is a little bit ambiguous. I'm not entirely certain, but there are 7 feasts in Israel, and Christ fulfills them. These 3 have not been fulfilled yet, and these 4 have. And so, once again, with this, I'm not entirely certain. I didn't get to research that as much as I'd like to, and I'd like to see more people talk about it and have more time to dig into that a little bit. But the point is that Christ is going to fulfill all of these feasts, either at his second coming or he already has. And so we're waiting on some of those to be fulfilled. But there is a case of blasphemy. A son of Israel cursed the name of the Lord, or pierces the name of the Lord, and Moses tells them he needs to be stoned, and there's some additional laws that have been revealed already to the Israelites, and they all stone him. That's, once again, how serious God takes his covenant community. There's a specific holiday called Jubilee, and it lasts an entire year. They are not to plant crops or work for an entire year. It is work too, right? They're not supposed to do anything for an entire year. Trust that God is going to provide for them. And they return all property to its original owner. Joshua 13 through 21, that super boring map where land is given to certain tribes and the allotments are given and all of that stuff. All of it is returned. And you gotta really think about this, meditate on this, the economic implications of giving up everything that you have accumulated for the last 7 years. You just give it back to its original owner. You release all of your hired workers, you let them all go. You're just hey, if you want to stay, you can, but go ahead and do whatever, And it's a pretty big thing to trust that the Lord is going to provide an entire year's worth of food and money and existence for you, and from last year's yield. Probably.
Did they prepare for that, knowing that it was coming?
God said that he would bless them if they followed these laws. He said he would bless them in the 6th year that would carry them through the 8th year, actually. So it's 2 years worth of stuff that they need, because they don't plant crops for a whole year. Then they plant crops the next year, and those crops have to grow before they actually get more food. So it's really 2 years of being without, a job, essentially, not working for that long. It's a really big economic impact on you. So they return all their property, and there's a practice under here called the kinsman redeemer, and we see this actually done in the book of Ruth. It's when families buy back land that their family members have sold before the year of Jubilee, and they do this in order to keep it under their name. We don't necessarily value land the same way they did, but their land was given to them by God, so they wanted to keep it within the family. And that's why, we don't really have time to talk about a lot of it, but there's instances where people's inheritance, there's an issue with it and who gets it, because there's no living males to carry on the family name. This happens in the book of Ruth. It is a picture of Christ purchasing us from our sins and our death. They are to trust that God is going to sustain them for this amount of time. And that's in chapter 25, 18 verse through 22. They are not to treat Israelite nationals as slaves, but always as hired workers. So people who are living in the land or who are part of the covenant community, they're not supposed to get treated like slaves. And then the last little section of the book is a tag at the end of the chiasm to summarize it. It's a call to faithfulness. Moses calls the people to be faithful. And I know it's really hard to read because it's really small. I ran out of room. But if they obey, they will be blessed. And if they disobey, they will be cursed. And as typical with blessings and cursings in the Bible, the cursing list is much, much longer than the blessing. And so they can be, if they do run away from the presence of Lord, or turn away from God's presence, it says, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers and their unfaithfulness which they committed against me, and also in their acting with hostility against me, I also was acting in hostility against them to bring them into the land of their enemies. Or if their uncircumcised heart becomes humbled so that they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham as well. And I will remember the land. I will bring them back, essentially. He's going to restore them to their state of blessing. I will remember them for the covenant of their ancestors, who I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. God still wants to be their God, even if they sin. He wants them to return. He chastens us so that we look back to him always. But I'm not going to issue you a conclusion to this book, because Leviticus doesn't exist in a vacuum. So here we are at the book of Numbers. You can go to the next slide.
I think it's really interesting that in Leviticus 11 that it's kind of sort of like the Somalians are still living that way with the unclean, the split, that they think that them
They do have
that they aren't allowed to eat like pagan stuff with when you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, no, the Jews still do that today. They keep kosher, and also Muslims do too. They have
they're still all living according to.
And I mean, Christians do it in one sense too. Like, we don't, touch immoral things, but we can eat meals and shellfish and stuff like that. And that's not a problem for us, because Jesus nullified some of these commands in the New Testament. So, the book of Numbers, Beit Midbar, in the wilderness. In keeping, once again, with our theme, it's the most prominent word in the first line of the book. And the English name is also describes some aspect of the book. There's a census at the beginning and at the end. It's super exciting to read. I know that you guys will. But the census is for the people who participate in the narrative that follows. So, chapter 1, verse 1. Let's go to that. All right. Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, did you guys catch that? The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting. So whatever happened between Leviticus, between the beginning of Leviticus and the end of Leviticus, it worked. Moses can now go into the tent of meeting. This is a really significant thing. That's the conclusion to the book of Leviticus. Their rituals, their purity laws, all of that stuff, it worked. Moses can go in now. Chapter 1 is mostly census. The Levites are not numbered because they deal with the tabernacle. And they're set apart for the Lord's consecration to work in the tabernacle and all of that stuff. Chapter 2, we see the way that the Israelites set up their camp, and I didn't draw a picture of it, but this is kind of what it looked like. It's like the people disagree, on kind of how it was set up. These could have been parallel rather than in a straight line, but the tabernacle is in the center. And then the Levites surround it, and then the 3 tribes on each direction. Judah leads the whole thing. They're in the front. If we remember back to the previous books, Judah is who the lion is going to come from, the lion of the tribe of Judah, and the scepter will not depart from him. He is the one who's going to lead, and we all follow somebody who was born in the tribe of Judah, of the line of Judah, which is Jesus. He is a descendant of Judah. So 3 through 4 are descriptions, and 2 through 4, I guess, kind of, but they're descriptions of the Levitical priesthood, and just some additional information about that. 5 through 6, additional information about the purity of the camp. Israel must remain holy. Most of these things seem kind of straightforward when you realize that we're talking about ritual purity, moral purity, holiness, those types of things. The categories they're there. But what do we do with strange things like Numbers 5, 11 through 31? There's this weird ritual where they mix up a potion and they give it to a woman who's accused of adultery, and she drinks it and her womb shrivels if she's guilty, but if not, it doesn't happen. So God is involved in this ritual. This is weird. It's really strange. Monica Wilson, she's a South African anthropologist. She's gone, but she's a South African anthropologist. She said, rituals reveal values at their deepest levels. We do rituals based on what we value. I'm about to go to Portland and walk across the stage because I achieved a degree last year. And that is a ritual. We're showing, and depending on how elaborate the ritual is how much we value the thing. So we have these big ceremonies and commencement and rituals where think about the Super Bowl. That's a ritual. And look at how much we value it. We get all sorts of people involved in that. And millions of people watch it. Like a third of the country pays attention to that. I guess I'm in the 2/3 that don't. But rituals play a high role in society just generally. We all do this kind of stuff. So this is a really strong picture of how much they're supposed to value the purity and the sanctity of marriage. They do this elaborate, drawn-out ceremony.
Matt, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It seems like in the Old Testament there are a lot of different tests like this given to women to make sure that they are holy. What about the men?
Yeah.
In your readings, have you uncovered anything where the men were, they could be charged with adultery too?
Yeah.
And yet, was any test given to them to decide if they were innocent or guilty?
Tests were given to Abraham all the time about, and he failed a lot of them. He goes down to Egypt, and his wife suffers because of him failing the test. He passes his wife off into the harem of Egypt, and then God rescues her. But this was a test to see if Abraham would act faithfully. We just saw Nadab and Abihu, they died. God killed them because they weren't taking their role seriously. And I'm not going to go too crazy with this because I'm not sure that I've hashed it all out myself, but there is, at least in part, some idea of distortion of leadership roles between men and women, and it's because of the fall. So men are, the priests are all men in this situation. They're held to a very high standard. They're not supposed to do anything to profane. Later, God kills Eli and his sons because they're disrespecting the thing, and they're disrespecting the tabernacle. And Eli's sons are forcing women to sleep with them. It's horrible stuff. And God allows these types of things to continue on for the time, but there will come a day when He judges everybody's sin, and nobody will be, absolved of that. So I think that, men and women are both held to high standards. I think it's a lot more about leadership, though. Whoever's in a leadership role is held to the highest of standards. So I don't know why this ritual is so prominent here, but does that answer your question? Kind of. Okay. I think it's a learning process, and we continue to ask questions like that and pay attention to how much women are valued by God and by people, with a comparison there, because the Bible does indicate that God has a higher view of women than people generally do, than society generally does. So, moving on, Numbers 6, 22 through 27 is that famous blessing that Elevation took and made into a song. The Lord bless you and keep you, make His face shine upon you. That's just cool to see that, there it is, right in the Bible, a thing we sing. And that's good. We should sing Scripture more often, no matter who produces it. So, chapters 7 and 8, the Levites are instituted. And then chapters 9 through 10, they prepare for the journey. They're going to have a road trip. They're going to leave Sinai. They have been here for about one calendar year. Numbers 10 verse 11 tells us that. Now in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th of the month, the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony. So God is picking up shop, and they're going to follow the cloud into the wilderness. It has been 11 months and 20 days since Exodus 19:1 when they arrived, and now it's time to go. A little bit over 40 years pass in the rest of the book. So we just spent from Exodus 19 all the way until Numbers 10 verse 11 before Mount Sinai. That's 1 year, around 1 year. Now 40 years are going to pass in the last 20 chapters. So it's you see time speed up and slow down just like any story does. But just keep that in mind as you're thinking about these things. This isn't like the next few months. This is the next 40 years. All their ritual holidays have been established, all of their purity laws and all of that stuff. It's time to go to the promised land. And it goes just about as badly as it could possibly go. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of them in the outskirts of the camp. So they're complaining against the Lord, and God starts killing them because this is not okay. They should not be, butting heads so hard with God. They should be listening to him. They should be paying attention to him. Mentioned is the rabble in chapter 11, verse 4. They are considered to be similar to the mixed multitude, and we're not supposed to be like them. It could be that these were a mixed crowd of kind of like rough dudes or whatever, gang kind of guys or whatever. Or it could just be people in the Israelite community complaining. But we're not supposed to be like them, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 10. So, next, you can go to the next slide. It's the last one. We have this chiasm of their traveling situation here in chapters 10 through 21. And I can't go through all these stories, but there's fire of the Lord consumes them, and then there's manna and quail, and Moses complains. Miriam and Moses, or Miriam and Aaron rebel against Moses. Rebellion against the Exodus. That's the central point. We'll stop there for a second. They send out 12 spies to go check out the promised land, and 2 of them return with a good report, and the other 10 have a bad report. What's interesting is in Joshua 2 verse 1, 2 men are sent out. So it's like they learned their lesson, like, yeah, we probably shouldn't send 12. We'll just send 2 this time, because last time there was only 2 that had anything good to say about this. But, the land is so abundant that they have to carry fruit on a pole in between them with 2 people. Like, they cut down one branch of food, and they bring it back, and it's so heavy that that's just how abundant it is that it's so heavy that 2 people have to carry it. Caleb and Joshua want to take it, but the others are afraid. Moses intercedes in a similar fashion to the way that he did in the golden calf incident. There's an appeal to God's character, and the Lord's description is mentioned again in chapter 14, verse 18, like, the Lord, abundant in loving kindness and steadfast love and mercy and grace, showing mercy to thousands of generations, but visiting the iniquity on the 3rd and 4th generation. God issues a judgment because of their rebellion. They are just completely, disregarding God and His precepts at this time. He says in 14:29, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. So, judgment is issued, and then they start to work back out. There's the water, and Moses rebels. Moses is allowed into the tabernacle, or into the promised land until this point, when he rebels against God. And why he did that is something you can look up on your own. Rebellion against God and the burning snakes. The snakes that come, there's this weird story about them lifting up the bronze serpent in the wilderness. And Jesus talks about it in John 3. we always talk about, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only son, all of that. But he's talking about the story of the bronze serpent on the pole. We're supposed to look to the cross where Jesus was lifted up and be saved from our sins, just like they looked to this bronze serpent. And the burning part just means the snakes, when they bit you, it feels like fire. So it's similar to the first section or whatever. But then we have in chapter 22, and actually that serpent, later on in the Bible, it ends up becoming a stumbling block. They start to worship it. And they put it up as an idol to be worshipped in, I don't remember where it is, but it's in the time of the kings. Then we have the Balak and Balaam narrative in chapter 22 through 25. And all of this stuff happens in the wilderness of Moab towards the end of the book. But Balak is presented as a pharaoh-like figure. Israel is, this scene, chapters 22 through 25, takes place during this time. I don't know exactly where, but it's during that time. This is happening meanwhile. In 22, verse 3, Moab fears Israel because they were numerous and they covered the ground and they were going to be more powerful. That sounds a lot like Pharaoh in Exodus 1, verse 9, who's afraid of the Israelites because there's so many of them, they might, overtake us if there's a war, join our enemies or something like that. Balak wants to curse Israel. Whoever curses the seed of Abraham will be cursed themselves. Balak makes 3 failed attempts to curse Israel, and Pharaoh tried 3 times to destroy Israel with 3 different methods. In Balak's 3rd attempt, it results in a prophecy about the Messianic king, and in Pharaoh's 3rd attempt, it results in Moses being delivered through the waters. So here we have the Savior coming from evil's attempt to destroy the Savior. And then we get to Balaam. Balaam is a hired sorcerer. Common thing in those days, you would hire somebody to curse your enemies. And he was brought in to curse Israel. He's resistant the whole time. But he ends up going. His donkey freaks out and talks. That's a whole thing. We could talk about that for a long time. But he encounters the Lord, the angel of the Lord. And who he encounters him as is a Satan. That word transliterates to Satan. So now we have this dilemma. The angel of the Lord has just been called Satan by the Bible. What is a Satan? The Dictionary of Biblical Languages says it's an adversary. So it's not a personal name. It's just an adversary. Natural or supernatural being who opposes another, either as a verbal antagonist, a slanderer, an accuser, or a physical opposition. The Hebrew Aramaic lexicon says it's an adversary, an opponent, military or political, celestial figure near the throne of the Lord, in his court, an accuser, a plaintiff. So, who is called a Satan? I'm going to camp here a little bit because I just want you to, just consider this, the fact that of what this evil spiritual being is, who we don't want to have anything to do with, compared to the Lord, who we want to have everything to do with. Here, in this situation, it's the angel of the Lord that's called a Satan. David is called a Satan in 1 Samuel 29. The sons of Zeruiah who surrender to David, they're called a Satan, and David shows mercy to them. There's a lack of Satan in Solomon's life when he makes a treaty with the king of the king of Hiram. But then later, the Lord raises up a Satan who is named Hadad. And then the first occurrence of this word that references a seemingly evil spirit is someone who influences David to do the sin of making a sentence. However, this is a little bit hard to deal with because 1 Chronicles 21. it says, "Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel." It's presented as a name there. But then the parallel cross-reference in Samuel 24 is, "Now the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, 'Go and number Israel and Judah.'" So it seems more reasonable to think that wasn't a personal name, because it's always with an article, to say like the Satan, not Satan. And here it's it or he. The Hebrew verb can be referencing either. So it seems like the anger of the Lord is presented as a Satan.
How do you spell that word?
It's the same you spell Satan. But this is the
Oh,
Hebrew.
really?
This is the Hebrew, letters for it. Anyways, so that's a little bit ambiguous, and I think it's going to take some time to think about those types of things. Job 1, verse 6 and 2, verse 1, it seems like this spirit who is in opposition to God is neutral. But it also does say that he came from wandering the earth and walking around on it. And we remember in the New Testament that Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven," or "I saw the Satan fall like lightning from heaven." So it could be the evil spirit that is referenced specifically there. Psalm 109, verse 6, "A Satan is called to be an ally of the writer of that psalm." So this guy, whoever is writing this psalm, he wants a Satan to come to his enemies. He wants an adversary for his enemies. So this guy, whoever is going to be a Satan, is actually an ally to the writer of this specific psalm. But in Zechariah's prophetic vision, the Satan is standing at God's right hand to accuse Joshua the high priest in that day. So this is in reference, as far as I can tell, this is in reference to an evil spirit called the accuser. So a conclusion on this idea for now. I'm not trying to confuse you or anything. There is an evil spirit, a specific evil spirit, who is against humanity and against God's purposes. Most of the time this word is used, though, it's in reference to people or even God. But there is a spiritual being who tempts humanity of sin and accuses humanity of guilt. Satan is called the accuser. And whatever it is apparently in God's throne room, even before God. Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah describes the angels as seraphim, which is burning serpents. We encountered a serpent in the garden, and this was at a time when heaven and earth, there was a much greater overlap than there is now. So there is a serpent in the garden, and Isaiah sees serpents as seraphim, burning serpents as angels. So this is like a serpent in the garden. Are you making that connection there? Is that this is an angel who's in rebellion against God's purposes. My main point with giving you this whole entire spiel is that Satan is not a name, it's a function. And whatever it is, it's not given the dignity of a name. It's just called the adversary. In the Bible, people's names are very meaningful, and God is the one who makes names great, like he wants to make Abraham's name great. And he wants to do that on his terms. But this creature, this spiritual being, is not allowed the dignity of even a name, which is consistent with the fact that Christ humiliated this thing completely on the cross through his resurrection. This is the author of death, and Christ thwarted that by resurrecting. So, I would suggest going and looking up Tim Mackey's video on the Satan and demons. Is very, very good, and it made a lot of things click for me. It's phenomenal. Michael Heiser, Christian, knows who he is. He worked on it. But for now, we're going to return back to Balaam.
So when you speak about the Satan, or when the Bible does, it's
Yeah.
not necessarily speaking about Satan himself.
It's not always speaking about Satan himself. It's speaking most of the time about people, and sometimes about God. And that's, it's kind of crazy to think of that, but because we have it ingrained in us that Satan is the specific being, but the word just means adversary. It's not a proper noun. And I didn't really do much research in the New Testament. The word just carries like straight over. I think they just call him the adversary for the most part in the New Testament as well. But anyways, I'm going to look more into that as I live longer and have time to do other things. Back to Balaam. He's resistant to Balak's request. If you give me a house full of silver, I still don't want to do this. He doesn't want to do it the whole time, but he tries to curse Israel and finds it impossible. He announces blessings and even prophesies of the Messiah, drawing our minds back to Genesis 49, where we learn about this messianic king who's coming, from whom the scepter will never depart. This king is going to be a ruler. He's going to conquer all the nations. Important to note here is that this is a pagan prophet, and the Lord put a word in his mouth, and the Spirit of God came upon this guy. So God has control over the pagan prophets if he wants to. He directs history. He directs the flow of history the way that he desires it to go. So when things are not going good, and when nations are crumbling, and when there's war and rioting and sickness and all of that stuff, you need to remember that God is in control of reality. So we got to speed through the rest of the book. Chapter 25 here, Balaam does get Israel to commit Baal worship, and that's involves child sacrifice and having sex with prostitutes and stuff like that. And Peter is not so fond of Balaam in the New Testament, and neither is Jesus in the book of Revelation. They bring him up again, and we see what Jesus and Peter think of Balaam and what kind of guy he was. Not a great one. So in chapters 26 through 36, the P-Landy is dandy. Promised land, it's coming. We're going to get it. They make preparations to go into the Promised Land, and another census is taken. There's a couple things highlighted. Joshua is commissioned as the new leader of Israel. There's some regulations, and it highlights the Israelites who have had victory over many of their enemies. Adad, the Amorites, Bashan, Moab, and Midian, Israelite, throughout this book, they have had victory over some of their enemies in battle. Reuben and Gad settle in the land. They actually pick a spot, and they're like, we want to stay here. And everyone freaks out, but they explain themselves like, no, we're going to go in, and we're going to conquer the nations with you, but then we're going to come back and we're going to live here because we like it here. So there's this progressive reception of the Promised Land. They're starting to settle in the land. Wilderness travels are revealed. The Levites, their cities are named, and there's a story about inheritance. And you guys can read all of that on your own. For now, despite Israel's numerous failures and an entire generation getting barred from entering the Promised Land, the book ends on a pretty high note, or sort of high note at least. Israel has been victorious over several pagan nations that are in the area, and some of them have even started to settle in the Promised Land. And so that is the book of Leviticus and Numbers. Amen and amen. All right. What do you have to say, Christian?
The critique.
I have a question.
I really like the parallel.
So when they had the 7 years of the Jubilee and God prepared, what happened to the debt that they owed other people? Did that all go away too?
That all goes away too, yeah. All of it. Isn't that nice? Like,
Yeah.
you go to school for 15 years or something like that, and it just all disappears like halfway through your education. But we don't do that here.
No.
It's different. But yeah, no, that's a pretty big economic implication.
Right.
Like, to cancel all debts.
I think we should think about that. You know, when we deal with people or loan them things or whatever, you know,
Like in the church, we're told to share our stuff, not in a communistic way, but out of a willing,
Generous.
sacrificial heart. You know, so it's really good. Anybody else have questions, comments, words of the Lord, tongues, and prophecy? Yeah.
If there was a Bible verse from Leviticus or Numbers that you would recommend as a memory verse,
Yes.
could you give us that?
I don't know if I have them from Numbers, but these 3 verses here, you can't see them if you guys want to write it down. Leviticus 11:44, 19 verse 2, and 20 verse 7. They all talk about God's holiness. You shall be holy as the Lord is holy. This is quoted in the New Testament by Peter. Kodesh, holy. And for this one, I would say maybe the best verse to memorize, I'm not exactly sure where it is. I had it on my computer actually though. Is probably, it's weird because, you know, I think one of the central things we want to remember is that an entire generation did not inherit the promised land. So I was going to say in this section here, the middle of this chiasm, it says your corpses will fall in the wilderness. I would say that's a good verse to memorize for the first part of the book. And then I'll find that for you in a second. But for the second section, I don't know if I have really a specific verse, because the Israelites start to settle in the land, and they start to, you know, it's kind of like a high note at the end of that book.
Out of all the people that were taken out of slavery, how many actually entered the promised land?
Well, I think the census in the new of the new generation is very similar to the 603,550 that was, and that's men. So it was about 2 million people-ish that came out of the promised land. I would say probably about 2 million entered, just of another generation.
Another generation.
It's actually what, 2? So
What's up?
that actually entered from
Yeah.
slavery to.
Oh yeah. Only
what
two,
I thought.
only
That's
two
what I
people
thought.
from
I thought.
from the time that the Exodus happened. It's just Caleb and Joshua. They're the only ones from that time who get to go into the promised land, and it's because they're the two who came back with a good report about the land. They were faithful and said, "Let's take this thing."
They weren't grasshoppers. Can you
Grasshopper.
flip that, please?
Yeah.
That was like one of my favorite parts in that particular story, is because the other 10 made the whole of Israel doubt and distrust God in their promised land. And that's why the earth opened up and swallowed them up, and God closed the earth back up again, and then each of those tribes were, and everything that they touched was swallowed up by the earth because they rebelled and caused Israel to distrust God over the fact that he was going to give them the promised land.
The verse where it says your corpses will fall in the wilderness is Numbers 14:29. So if you want to think about that, just think about how Israel rebelled, and meditate a little bit on the fact that God's judgment is very real, and He is going to issue that, and that's totally fine. He's the judge of the earth. We are not. So He gets to say what goes and what doesn't. Anybody else?
I think you're parallel to Ananias and Sapphira.
I think it is too. It seems. I mean, it only happens once. You know?
I've never thought about that.
It's a pretty prominent thing. Like I just thought, because we just were talking about it weeks ago. You know.
I think your table's right as well.
You think so?
I think so.
Yeah.
I haven't studied it in as much depth as I would do.
Me neither. It's. I mean,
It
the
makes
whole
sense.
entire thing is meant for a lifetime. So we hold it with an open hand. But yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Glad to
Some
do
kind
it.